Welcome to the Empaths Revolution podcast, the home of intersectional spirituality. Empaths Revolution is a platform dedicated to empowering, informing, and supporting empaths and other spiritually sensitive people via podcasts, expert guests, blogs, books, and personal one-to-one and group support. I'm your host, Harris Eddie Hill, and I'm non-binary, neurodivergent, and an intuitive empath. I'm a podcaster, best-selling author, NLP practitioner, and timeline therapist, and I'm pleased to bring you today's episode. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Empaths Revolution podcast. And today I'm joined by the amazing Eli Hardwood, who I met on TikTok, and she is an amazing attachment therapist who's been in practice for 15 years, didn't you say?
Yes. Yep.
Nice.
A long time. 1.5 decades. It's kind of wild.
That's cool. How did you get into attachment?
Mostly my own attachment trauma. That's what I would say. So I have a family tree that is hung primarily with the ornaments of addiction, domestic violence, and mental illness. So my mom was a cycle breaker. When I was about 9 years old, she said, I can't keep doing this. Something's wrong. I'm not okay. And she went and got help. And no one had ever done that in our whole family system. And then after she got help, she went and got her counseling degree. And there was this massive before and after in my childhood, from before she had support to after she had support. And it was still a process. It's still in process, of course. But I had a lot of injury pre that turning point. She identifies as bipolar 2. My dad's an alcoholic. My brother's bipolar. So I basically grew up in this, emotional tornado. And so when that happens to a kid, there's this kind of pathway you end up on, right? One direction or the other. And my pathway was always being the healer. I was always attuned to what everybody else was feeling and what they needed. And anyway, so through that process, once I hit my 20s and I was trying to have a secure romantic relationship, it was very clear to me that there were all kinds of wires crossed up inside of me. It was like I would get close to someone and it was terror that they were going to leave me or something terrible was going to happen. And I could feel that the volume of what was going on inside of my body didn't match what was going on in my relationship. I was like, this person's actually might like me more than I like them, but I am like freaked the fuck out that they are going to check out on me. So what's that about? And so then I started my own therapy process. And it was in that process that I learned about attachment. And it's, one of those life things when you hit on some truth or some theory and it just resonates with your entire being. It was like, I just was blown open and everything made sense and my whole world made sense and my path forward made sense. And it made sense to become a therapist. And 15 years later, now it makes sense to try and educate people so that maybe their kids will need less therapy when they get older. That's kind of the goal.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's amazing, even watching, like I'm in my 30s and watching like my sister and like other parents my age, that seems weird to say, but other parents my age and how they're parenting their children so differently to how we were parented. There's like less telling off and shaming and blaming and more explanation and more like diverting behaviors that they want to do into a productive thing. And I mean, obviously there's lots of change going on, but I mean, what kind of things are you seeing that really you're seeing as like a pattern that more parents should know about?
Well, so in general, there's this really powerful conversation that to me is maybe the most interesting in this arena, which is the idea of the way that our minds have become colonized. So the way that colonization affected how we think about everything. And then it's taken into this kind of arena around parenting and the idea that we want to decolonize parenting. So the goal is actually not to create something entirely new in parenting, but to return to something that was actually really present in a lot of indigenous communities, in Europe, in North America, South America, Africa, a knowledge around the power of the connection between a parent and a child that really got disrupted as dominion became the most important thing in world history, right? Taking control of someone else's land, someone else's culture, the imperialistic mindset that is still so present in my country. That got so infiltrated into the way we parent. So the tools for parenting were the tools of colonization. I'm going to take away your power. I'm going to strip down your sense of safety. I'm going to take control of you and mold you into who I want you to be, right? And what we see is that creates trauma because it's fundamentally against the attachment instinct. Because the attachment instinct, very simply put, is when we are in distress, we have a primary caregiver we focus on, run to, cling to, and find soothing from, okay? But if our primary caregiver believes their job is to control us and to eliminate us of needs and to eliminate us of expression of emotion, that fucks the whole thing up. I'm so glad you gave me permission to swear.
Always.
Yeah. Sorry, I am going to cough because I am on day 15 of COVID. So I still have a little bit of the COVID cough going on.
Bless you.
I know. Happy to be okay. That's all I can say. So the pattern that I see that's hopeful in parenting is what I would argue a return to more indigenous wisdom of recognizing that we are wired for connection and that when we attend to our children and we are present with our children, not permissive, that gets really mixed up, right? We don't just say, oh, sure, honey, throw the ball at someone else's head, right? But that we are in tune with what their developmental stage is, what their needs are, how hungry they are, how tired they are, and we help to meet their needs in relationship. The learning process doesn't have to involve this trauma honestly, for kids or parents. I don't think that parents that are trying to control their kids are having a good time. I think they feel terrible. So the move away from a control model of parenting into a connection model of parenting. And I would argue that a control model of parenting is actually either on either end of the spectrum, either authoritarian, I'm the boss, or permissive, the kid's the boss. Whereas connection parenting is far more about there being a teacher and a guide and a support system for a child, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you're describing this. And I think in our sort of culture in the West, there, especially from people who subscribe to really kind of toxic culture norms, I don't know about you, but I see a lot of fear that, if you're too kind or you're too loving or you're too connected, then you're going to produce children who are useless, lazy, and ineffective adults, basically. Right. And obviously, I know intuitively that's the opposite.
Right, but there's this, and that's where I think the colonization piece comes in. So that's the story or the narrative that justified violence towards people who had less power, right? So the story is, I'm doing this for your own good. But actually, no, that's never been the case. I'm doing this because I can't tolerate the way that this makes me feel. And so I want to shut down what you feel, and I want to shut down what you have to learn or the messiness around that. Yeah. I'm curious, when you've been, kind of engaged with my material, what are pieces for you that you have felt were new or sparked a different way of thinking about kind of these topics? I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but
I think I think the reason that I connected so strongly with your materials, because you're often putting things into words that I already know and I feel, or maybe I've experienced. So it was more the validation that comes with watching your stuff that really called to me. And also, as I mentioned before we started recording today, attachment was something I came across it about four years ago, and it's been a big, massive puzzle piece for me in my healing. And
I love that.
Yeah, and I like it's just one of the real key subjects that I just feel that everyone should be taught, because it's so important, even just to be able to recognize who I can have secure attachment with and how to do that. Like, that's huge.
Absolutely. Well, and when you grow up in an insecure attachment, your body is wired to anticipate a process that's insecure and to relate through those avenues, right? So the process of understanding attachment then allows you to recognize, oh, these are insecure patterns. What does a secure pattern look like? And how would I relate like that? And so you kind of have to go against your biology for a little while.
Yeah.
To move into a new way of relating.
Yeah. I have to say, I listened to I listen to all my books on audio because I don't have the concentration to sit and read.
Yeah.
And I listened to this book about attachment, and it discussed all of the, can you still hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. It discussed all the different types of insecure attachment, which you can talk about in a second if you would like to. And I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that. And then when they described secure attachment, how that looks, how that feels, I got so emotional. I was like, it's real. What I've wanted all of this time is real.
Oh, that made me tear up. Yes, absolutely. And you know, that what that speaks to is that your body is wired for it.
Yeah.
Because to resonate with something you have never experienced, but to have known it was something that could be, is a sign of how human it is.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. So for the listeners who are not familiar with attachment styles, do you want to just give a brief overview of the different types?
Yep. So let me start by, I know I defined it a little bit, but so attachment is a survival drive that every human being has, like our drive for hunger and our drive for thirst, to seek out a larger, more competent human being to protect us and support us when we have tender needs or distress. And those are the research words, by the way, tender needs and distress. And the idea is that the human brain is so complex, and it evolves so complexly because it doesn't finish cooking in utero. It continues to cook all the way up until about age 3. 80% of our brain is developed by the time we're 3 years old. And so in order for that to occur, for our complex system to have the time it needs to develop, we rely on a caregiver as opposed to an elephant. You know, have you ever seen an elephant birth? They're quite remarkable. They come out and they literally just walk right out of the womb. It's like the sac comes off and they just go walking, right? They have all these skills. They have independence very early on because their brain has gotten to a fairly complete place by the time that they are out of utero, whereas the human brain has a long way to go when we're out of utero. So attachment allows the human brain to develop more and keeps small human beings safe, right? And it keeps the rest of us safe, because if there's a village of us against a saber-toothed tiger, we're far more likely to survive if it's, you know, scrawny old me and stripey guy over here, right? Like I'm unlikely to win that battle, but if there are 20 of us, I could win and I could survive. And so it's something that protects our species. That makes sense. Okay. So in the research, what we know, a lot of what we know, comes from studying infant attachment, and specifically a research tool called the strange situation. Do you know about the strange situation? Cool. This is where I get really nerdy. So God bless you all for listening. But essentially, a caregiver child dyad is taken into a room where there's some toys and they play, and then a stranger comes in the room and they play some more, and then the caregiver leaves the child alone in the room with the stranger. And this doesn't last for more than 3 minutes. But during those 3 minutes, we're observing what happens to this child, because there are a few different things that always activate distress in small children. Darkness is one of them, but that's hard to research. And strangers are another one, because human beings are one of the primary threats to other human beings, right? So leave this child in this room alone with a stranger, observe. Then they have the caregiver come back and they watch what happens between the infant and the caregiver. What does the infant believe? Oops, did I lose you? No? Okay. What does the infant believe about the caregiver's ability to take care of them? Okay. Then after that reunion, the caregiver and the child play for a while, the stranger leaves, and then the caregiver leaves the child totally alone. And this is a third form of distress, is being alone as a small child in a strange place. They leave the child totally alone for under 3 minutes. And then they bring the parent back and they watch what happens. So this child's attachment system has been activated and stressed 2 different times in a gradient of increasing distress. Okay? And what they found is this very clear set of reactions from infants towards caregivers. And then they did longitudinal studies to connect, how does this affect a child over time? What does it look like in adulthood? What does this mean in a person's life? Children who are securely attached do 3 things. 1, they cry when their caregiver leaves. They show outwardly an upset that their caregiver has left the room. They want them there. They find them comforting.
Wow.
Okay. 2, when the caregiver returns, they seek proximity. And we score these babies on like a set for each of these different qualities. We score them 1 to 6. So a highest proximity seeking child literally runs across the room, and the caregiver, there's a line of tape. The caregiver isn't allowed to cross it. So we're really looking at, what does the baby experience of this caregiver? So children who score highest on proximity seeking run across the room and literally climb their mother. They don't even give, and I say mother because primarily that's who the research is on. However, it has been done on folks with different identities, on dads. So it really is about caregiving. Anyway, they climb up the caregiver, but don't even wait for them to pick the child up. It's like, I'm going to get as close to you as possible. And then, and this is key, they soothe within 3 minutes of being in proximity of that caregiver. So secure children prefer their caregiver to others in moments of distress. So let me be clear, because extroverted children sometimes like strangers because they're excited to meet new people. That doesn't mean that they prefer a stranger to their parent. But if they went to a stranger in a moment of distress, that would be concerning. We'd be like, what just happened? So in distress, secure children prefer their caregiver. They seek them out actively, and then they are easily and quickly soothed. Okay. And then we'll talk about how this applies to adulthood. But the second set of babies are called the ambivalent babies. And the ambivalent babies also cry when their caregiver leaves. And they're very upset outwardly. Okay. But when their caregiver returns, they do this funny thing called protest, which is they make some form of a direction towards the caregiver, but then they do something that signifies that they are ambivalent about reconnecting with the caregiver, and they're mad at the caregiver for leaving. So they might, I have one particular video in my head of this baby who ran towards the caregiver, looks at them, gets halfway there, and literally just makes a U-turn and runs the other direction. Or yells for the caregiver and won't go to the caregiver, but wants the caregiver to come to them. Or goes to the caregiver and hugs, but as the caregiver picks them up, they do this. They push their arms back. And the very key thing is they do not soothe. So they stay in protest mode. And the reason that they do this is because this is a caregiver who is unpredictable in some way. And a baby knows that if they protest, that gets them more attention, which keeps the caregiver closer to them more often. So it's actually an effective strategy for creating proximity with a caregiver who isn't predictable. Okay. And then the third set of babies are the avoidant babies. And the avoidant babies don't show signs of distress when their caregiver leaves. They look calm. They're playing with their toys. And when their caregiver returns, they don't seek them out and they don't express distress. They essentially, I call these the John Wayne babies. They look like they don't need anybody. When Westerners are shown, this is a separate research protocol, but they've been shown when Western parents are shown videos of the 3 different types of babies, and asked to score who they think the secure baby is, they usually think it's the avoidant baby, because the avoidant baby isn't expressing emotion.
Wow.
Right, but no. And there's been further research on the avoidant babies, and what we found is that they have the same cortisol spikes as the other sets of babies who are expressing their distress outwardly. They have those same cortisol spikes. They just don't show you. So one of the myths we have about avoidantly attached folks is that they don't feel as distressed as other people, but that's not true. They just don't show it. And then there's a fourth category of babies who don't have a pattern. And those babies are babies of serious neglect and abuse. One of the most disturbing videos I ever saw, a little girl identified child was making, I mean, only way I can describe it is like animalistic sounds upon the reunion. So the caregiver came back in and she made these noises that felt like growling almost. And she walked toward the caregiver because you could tell she knew she was supposed to, like she'd get in trouble if she didn't, but she put her arms in the other direction. It was like, yeah, it was like her brain was ripped into two. Her attachment brain was saying, I need my caregiver because I'm unsafe. But her amygdala, her safety brain was saying, no, my caregiver is the thing that's unsafe, right? And so my brain's going to get scrambled. My personal belief is that children with disorganized attachment styles develop into adults with personality disorders.
Wow.
Because
I can see that.
We call it a theory of mind. So our theory of mind develops in relationship to our caregivers. The way that our caregivers ascribe meaning and intention to our actions and our feelings, and the intentions they actually have towards us, create a template for us about what relationships mean and are. So if our caregiver is trying to hurt us, we grow up into adults who believe that people who are close to us want to hurt us. And then we're paranoid and controlling and erratic, right? If we believe that we are dangerous or that we are terrible, right, then when we get into a close relationship with someone, we might push them away because even though we want them close, we're afraid that we're toxic and we might actually end up hurting them. Whereas a baby who grows up in a secure experience feels like relationships are for soothing. This is where I get calm and this is where I belong and I let my feelings out and I get regulated. We talk about co-regulation, that the human body is designed to co-regulate with other human beings. Yeah, so in adulthood, we put slightly different names on each of these labels. So the secure baby in adulthood is considered a secure or free autonomous style, right? And that doesn't mean I'm, separate from other people. I don't need them. It means that I just don't have a bunch of baggage around attachment. I love freely. I receive love freely. It doesn't feel complicated, right? The ambivalent baby is called a preoccupied style. The preoccupied adult feels constantly on watch for when their partner is going to not want them anymore. They feel they aren't worthy of love, and so they are hyper vigilant in relationships. If someone doesn't text them back within an hour, their heart rate is elevated. They're starting to sweat. There's a narrative in their head about what's happening and why. They need lots of reassurance, but they deeply struggle to receive it. So preoccupied folks often wear out their romantic partners because they're saying, do you love me? 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 And no amount of reassurance makes them feel loved. And people kind of feel like, you know what, I'm really tired of telling you. And also like, maybe I don't love you. It's like they almost convince their partners to do the very thing they're afraid their partners will do, which is check out. And then avoidant adults struggle to rely on their partners. They have a chronic belief that they are a burden to other people. We call them dismissive in adulthood. I would say there's a range of how dismissive an avoidant adult can be, right? Just like there'd be a range of preoccupation. Sorry. The most toxic version of a dismissive style in adulthood is somebody who is deeply dismissive of their partner's needs and emotions. believes that the best thing in the whole world is to think your way through your problems, not to feel your way through your problems. Everything is intellectualized. Anything emotional is demeaned. And oftentimes, these folks prefer to be in situations that involve little levels of commitment, because it feels very scary to have someone be dependent on them or to be dependent on somebody else.
Yeah.
And then disorganized folks often end up being emotionally abusive and toxic to their partners because they learn to relate through dominance and desperation. So they're hard.
It's really interesting because some time ago I dated somebody who revealed to me long after we'd already established something. They said, well, I've got borderline, didn't I tell you? And I was like, I would have remembered.
Yes.
But no, I said no, we hadn't discussed that. And it's interesting because I ended up feeling there was so much pushing and pulling, so much like drawing in and calmness, and then instantly followed by this completely out of nowhere, like, you know, I could have left the house at sort of 11 in the morning after having like a lovely evening the night before, staying over, having a long breakfast. And then by sort of 5, 6 the following evening, I've only left them hours before, I get this like enraged and or crying phone call of like, you know, like, I just don't think you feel the same way about me that I feel about you. And I was like, I literally saw you today and everything was fine. Like, where's this coming from? And in the end I said, like, and you know, I kept saying, listen, if you're feeling a certain way, then that's valid, but it's also not my problem and I haven't caused that. So I think you need to find a way to deal with that, because I'm not your therapist, like I'm not your parent. You know, I was sort of laying these boundaries, and then I would get this, oh yeah, of course, and then it'd be bulldozed like within a week. And eventually I said, listen, this isn't going to work out. And they said, oh, but you don't feel. I said, no, because I can't get there because it's not stable enough. Like, it's not, you know, in this time, had it been secure and stable, I probably would be there where you want me to be, but I can't because you're all over the place.
Well, one of the things, you know, I have in my career worked with a lot of folks who have personality disorders. And when I'm teaching other clinicians about that work, I say your first indication that someone has a personality disorder is that you become wrapped up in their narrative in a way that doesn't match your actual interaction in their world or their life. You become so important that you are idealized. And then you become so problematic that you are devalued. They are devouring you and spitting you out, devouring you and spitting you out. Whereas someone without a personality disorder is relating to you as a therapist. And you can feel that they're gaining information from you. They're letting you take care of them. They're letting you help them, but you aren't getting sucked in some way. And the compassion I have for that experience in terms of being a disorder is, it's like the Vietnam of childhood. So they have chronic, complex PTSD in the worst kind of way. And relationships are their Saigon. So I enter a close relationship, it's like I'm going back to the place of the original bloodbath. And I am disoriented, and I feel like I'm back there, and it feels like a war zone, even if the war is over and it's totally peaceful and there are, you know, no enemies in the arena. My body tells me there are, and so then I assume it's you. And so I keep trying to work out my past shit with you, which is impossible because you aren't my past shit. And until someone can really, we call it mentalize, get to that place where they can make the connection between these body memories and their body state and their past experiences, it's really sad. They just end up in and out of relationships really quickly and really painfully.
Yeah, I totally understand that. It's interesting because I've known and loved many people with borderline personality disorder. And I met someone through the coaching world some years ago. And she was originally diagnosed, I think she's talked very openly about her complex PTSD, regular PTSD,
Yeah.
and all of that sort of stuff, lots of childhood abuse. She wrote a book about it. And she no longer has borderline personality disorder.
That's amazing.
And I was like, she was the first person, because all the people that I've known with BPD have always felt to me like so traumatized that they shrunk themselves. And that's why there often was a lot of like, oh, whatever you want to do, you know, and or a bit of pushing and pulling. So it always felt to me like it was just extreme trauma.
It's hard to heal, though.
Yeah,
it really
very.
is good to heal. In part because it the only way that something that is broken in relationship like that can heal is in relationship, which demands someone who's willing to stick it out. And often that would be a self-sacrifice. So it's tricky. Do you, at this point in your journey, you identify as having earned a secure style? Yes.
Yeah.
Did you feel like there was one particular style that you grew up in that most exemplified the way that your insecurity played out growing up?
It's interesting. I think the real predominant one was the ambivalent anxious attachment. I think that was my biggest one. But actually, since doing like loads of self work, like I've been through 2 rounds of trauma therapy, like you name it, anything I could find, I was like, give it to me. And now that the anxious and you know, ambivalent attachment and all of that stuff is pretty much gone now. I have found and the disorganized, like, you know, I felt like there was some disorganized bits as well. Now I feel pretty much secure, but I do know there's a tiny bit of avoidant left or dismissive.
Sure. Yes. You know, I think of it as like our default settings. So a couple of things. If you have more than one caregiver who plays a role with you, you can develop a different style with each one depending on their way of relating. So my primary default setting is also ambivalent preoccupied, but I have some avoidant because I developed some avoidance in response to my dad. But as I've gotten secure over the years, my primary way of relating is secure. But if you stress me to a certain degree, my default setting still comes out. Actually, or you put me in a certain circumstance. I actually just recently got a book deal. So I'm very excited. And I'm going to be doing an attachment workbook for adults.
Nice.
Very excited. But I was going through the process, and the process is a lot of, you know, you put yourself out, you know, here's this book proposal, let's do this, and you wait. And it was very interesting to watch my neurobiology, because I haven't had something like this in so long, where I'm waiting to find out if I'm being chosen or not. And that preoccupied default was still there, where my brain just wants to kind of perseverate. That record's going to play. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to check my email. I'm going to check my email. I'm going to check my email.
Do you feel like it carries the same weight though? Because I noticed, so for example, I started a new job recently, and there was one time where another colleague who started the same time as me in the same job title, we bumped into each other at a train station, and he said, oh, I'm just going to go and grab a sandwich, I'll be right back, because we had ages to wait for this train to turn up. And then he never came back.
Oh,
so for 2 weeks there was this tiny little thing in my head going, maybe you smelled, or maybe or maybe it's something you said, or maybe you were trying to be too familiar, because I often find that I enjoy attachment so much now. Like, it doesn't matter who it is. I love getting to know people,
connecting with people.
But if something happens that's unexpected, then the little voice pops up and is like, it's probably something that you did. And I'm like, but at the same time, I notice the thought and I challenge it, and I can be like, well, even if that was the case, like, it's not the end of the world. But then the voice was like, but what if he like, what if somehow people have misconstrued something that you've done so badly that you lose your job? Like, it was going nuts. And I was observing this, like completely consciously. And I was like, you're literally being ridiculous now. And it was like, no, we need to really prepare for these things. I was like, oh, just shut up. Just shut up. So yes, like I think in new situations, or like situations that are a bit unfamiliar, those things can pop up, but it's not that I don't feel like it drives, it's not in the driver's seat anymore.
I love that analogy. Absolutely. It's a default setting, but it's no longer the captain of the ship. And what you were doing right there is mentalization. You were able to observe your emotional reaction, your thoughts, and have a meta reaction to those things and go, this doesn't feel right. And I did the same thing. So for instance, when this editor wasn't writing me back super quickly, or didn't write back when they said they would, I didn't write them again. Whereas earlier on in my life, I would have been like, is everything okay? Are we okay? Do you still like me? You still like me now? Right? And I could make a choice.
Yeah.
Recognize, oh, this is happening in my brain and in my body, and it feels uncomfortable, but I'm fine. It's okay. Worst thing that happens is I don't get this book deal, and I will be fine. Everything will be fine. Right?
I love that. Are you looking to get your energy in order, spring clean your life, and manifest things you actually want? My Align Your Life Starter Pack has helped people to relieve insomnia, anxiety, to become grounded, and to manifest exciting new things, as well as cut energetic cords with people who are draining their energy. And as a bonus, it's designed with non-visual and neurodivergent people in mind, so it's more accessible than most things currently on the market. Affordable and instantly downloadable, you can find it at mooksharrishill.com/mybl. Align your life, reclaim your power. Oh, something you said earlier, I wanted to ask you about it. So you were talking at the beginning about you were the one in the family that was, very attuned to other people, so on and so forth. This is something that I thought a lot about when I was sort of learning about codependency, and then how often people on the codependent scale and people on the narcissist scale are often in the same environments. It's the same environments that creates us, but it's the one that's able to intuit and kind of preempt stuff that ends up being the codependent, and then it's the one who can't do that ends up leaning into manipulation.
Yes.
So, but in my work, particularly as an empath and talking to other empaths, for me, being an empath is very much a spiritual gift, and it's not the same thing in my mind as like codependency.
I agree. I think they're different. Keep going.
Okay, so no, I just wanted to get obviously with particularly your attachment thing, and what you were saying before was that, you just came into your family as that type of person. So, I've heard, I'm not a fan. I don't follow her. I've seen maybe one video of hers ever, and it just enraged me. But Teal Swan was talking about empaths, and she was like, you'll never hear an empath say I love being around people. And I was like, oh, fuck off. Like, it really annoyed me, because she was equating being an empath to being a codependent, and confusing the two. And that's something I see all the time.
Is she the same woman who, she had a video that got pretty viral where she said, you are an empath. Essentially, you are an empath because you were traumatized, period.
Yes. Yeah.
And it like went around. She was like on a mic in a chair. She's got very like loud. Yeah. Okay. I saw it. I had the same reaction.
Oh, so,
thank God. Yes. My belief, and there is some research to support this, I wish we had more research, is that human beings have genetic predispositions around social sensitivities. So on one end of a spectrum, you have folks that we would, give a diagnosis of autism to. So we would say they are lower on the spectrum of sensitivity when it comes to reading social cues, okay? So they can pick up on patterns and learn patterns, but it isn't that intuitive, nonverbal cue process. On the opposite of the spectrum, and Elaine Aron is probably has done the cornerstone work in this research. She wrote the book, The Highly Sensitive Person. I would say are empaths. And her theory, which makes sense to me logically, is that between 10 and 20% of the population is wired to be highly sensitive, because in a evolutionary survival sense, every village needs to have a few people who notice when the wind changes direction, when the stranger who's peddling their wares feels funny, something feels off, and doesn't invite them into the village to stay for the night, right? Like they're also the shamans, the healers, right? They're paying attention to the little nuances, like, oh, when someone's eating that root, they don't tend to get sick in the same way as these other people are getting sick. I wonder if this root treats that. So that it is, I believe, a genetic predisposition, because otherwise it doesn't make sense why some of us evolve into empaths and some of us evolve into narcissists in these trauma situations. I have no other explanation for it. It's the one question when people say, like, why do some people, experience abuse and become abusers, and some people experience abuse and become healers? And my answer is, I have no fucking clue. I really don't. I've watched, I've listened. There's no degree. I see people in far less stressful home settings become terribly malignant narcissists. And then I see, the stories I've heard people survive through become some of the most shiny, loving, remarkable human beings on planet Earth. And why would that be if there wasn't some component? And you use the word spiritual, so there might be some other element that I'm not an expert in, something else, some je ne sais quoi. But I don't think it's something relational necessarily.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I've also met people who are empaths and didn't have a troubled upbringing. So I'm like, people like us seem to exist in all these different, so there doesn't seem to be like a common theme. It's interesting that you brought up the autism thing, because I'm on the spectrum, and I'm also awaiting testing for ADHD. But all of my pre-work that I've done is all like all the scores are sky high.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. And it runs in my family as well, so I'm kind of like not surprised. But it's interesting because I've met, I think there was some study out a little while ago. I don't have a head for details.
Yes.
And it was saying that autistic people typically are more empathetic on average than the average bear, but
interesting.
It's not, a lot of the time it's not necessarily communicated or obvious. Mm-hmm. And also it doesn't necessarily,
maybe less about what's being received and more about what's being communicated.
Yes, possibly. And also, like, I think a lot of the time, like, it's going in and that those areas of the brain are like strongly operating, but then it doesn't necessarily result in anything.
It doesn't come out. That's really interesting. There's a phrase that I learned. I've worked with eating disorders for a while, and I read this in a research paper at some point, and I thought it was the smartest phrase, but the phrase they used was emotion contagion. And the idea was you're more likely to have an eating disorder the higher your level of emotion contagion is. So how deeply and intensely and quickly and accurately do you catch other people's emotions? Which I think that fits into this idea of being an empath, of like, how quickly does it enter your body? I will say this, I have a lot of work to do in really studying autism and neurodivergence. It is an area that I have never specialized in, and it's coming up so relevantly in so many spaces right now. And I have felt like a deep sense of accountability of, okay, I need to dig in. So it's very interesting for me to hear you say, I identify as on the spectrum, I identify as an empath, because that totally blows out of the water my little, whatever I called that.
It's funny because, like, as I've gone through my sort of my own journey and my own healing and everything, and I've become more me and more sort of unapologetic and very open about what I think and what I believe, I've attracted to myself all of these, all of my close friends. Every single one of them has ADHD. and every single one of them is an empath or highly sensitive in the sensory sense. Or you know, they're very details people, like, you know, and even if, I mean, I've got one, she's like, oh, I don't think I am an empath, but at the same time, like, she is extremely notices if she meets someone who's got narcissistic tendencies, she'll notice within about the first 30 seconds. And she's usually right. So, you know, she's intuitive, or there's something going on there. And so I'm surrounded by all these very like neurodivergent and highly empathetic and highly attuned people. And it's really, even though I'm part of this community, it's also been a big realization for me as well. That,
how do you think that the two interplay for you? So where does autism and its expression and its impact in your life play out, and then how does that interact with being an empath?
I think for me, it just, because from a sensory profile, I'm a sensory avoider big time. So for me, I just feel like my intuition and my empathy is just a part of that. Like, I only had my sensory profile done about 6 years ago when I was 28. And when my occupational therapist looked at my scores, she was like, I've never seen an adult with scores this high, like with your sensitivities this extreme. She was like, I literally don't know how you've survived without any kind of help before. And I was like, yeah. So to me, it all kind of feels like I'm just sensitive across the board. And then I spent a lot of years like learning social stuff that I didn't know. And
do you feel that you always absorbed the emotions in the room, you just didn't know what they were or how to respond to them or what you needed?
I think I always felt them. I have like memories of being like quite a young child, and even like in the playground at school. The playground was mostly where people were laughing and playing and running around, and I would just walk the perimeter over and over again because I was like, this is just too much, and I needed time outside and away from people. Not because I didn't like them, but just because I was just overwhelmed. So I think that's always been there. And you know, even as a child, if I watched somebody else cry, I would automatically cry, and I still do that to this day.
Me too. So what I'm wondering and thinking about is how does attachment trauma, right? So we talked about that theory of mind. So my ability to walk into a social space and understand it. So if you grow up in an environment where there's not safe playfulness, a playground is extremely confusing, right? And so how do you process that? And you know, anyway, I'm just curious because we know attachment affects the brain significantly.
Yeah.
So I am curious about that, and ADHD as well. Again, those are probably the two areas I would say I have the least amount of expertise in.
Yeah.
But I do think interesting to think about the human need to have other human beings in sync with us.
Yeah.
And when we are in sync, there's a, especially in infancy, an instinct for movement, for close touch, which is proprioceptive touch.
Yeah.
It stimulates our nervous system, right? And vestibular, right? Movement, kind of this back and forth experience. It helps orient us to motion, to how our motor skills development occurs. It's curious to me, and it makes me wonder, will we at some point start to make connections between, you know, kids that maybe aren't held as often or who face more hostile faces in their environment? And what does that do to their brain development? And how does that potentially affect where they land on a spectrum or whether they have ADHD, or I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I don't know. I'm still very early on in my conversations around this. One of my friends from university has ADHD, and I was posting about it a little while ago, and she commented and said, obviously this is just anecdotal and this is just what one person has told me, but she said that a lot of people with ADHD are empaths because their brain is just so fast that they're absorbing a huge amount of data all at once.
And there's no filtering.
Yeah, basically. So that was one idea that she had. I also saw somebody talking about he has a what's the word? Not a theory. What's less than a theory? It's not proven. It's a hypothesis. That's the word I want to say.
Yes. Good. You found
it. His hypothesis is that there are more neurodivergent people being born, or one of the reasons that there could be more being born is that nature is trying to balance itself out. And that this could be sort of nature's answer to a world that's like gone a bit insensitive to itself and is like kind of eating it and killing itself.
Interesting.
I mean, obviously it's only a hypothesis.
I know. I love a good hypothesis. I mean, in the crazy world we live in, we need some hypotheses that make sense and that are hopeful. I mean, that's a hopeful hypothesis.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a nice idea, even if it's completely untrue.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. And also, I suppose if we think about like sort of the millennial generation that I'm part of, and possibly you, I don't know.
I'm an elder millennial, so
okay, cool.
I culturally identify with Gen X. That's where how I believe I was raised, but I am right on that cusp.
Okay, got you. So, you know, obviously parents, our parents' age, that was around the time where Ferberizing methods was really big, right? Which for the listeners is where it was very much like cry it out, let them soothe themselves when, you know, babies are way too young to do that.
And you know, what's interesting is Dr. Ferber has come out and said, I didn't ever intend for this to be a procedure that people used. He was talking to a particular family and giving a particular solution for a child that was actually quite old. And then it got commandeered into this kind of idea that you extinguish the crying by leaving your child for gradually longer periods of time until they eventually cry it out, which is totally counterintuitive to what we understand about attachment. But yes, that is an interesting correlation there.
Yeah, but I then think about the parents even before our generation and how, you know, were they even more detached or?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the great generation, right? Looking at each one, you know, so the boomers were doing a lot of Ferberizing. You know, my mother said to me with my young children, I was complaining about being tired, and she said, you know, when they'll sleep through the night. And I said, when? And she said, when you turn that monitor off. I was like, oh, Lord have mercy. Wow. No, that is not when they'll sleep through the night. That's when they will stop sending cues to me in the middle of the night. But so the boomers did a lot of that. Ferberizing, cried out, was very behavioral. You know, that was the kind of zeitgeist of psychology at the time. And the great generation was very punitive. And they were also traumatized. There was a depression. There were wars. There wasn't space for the nuances of playfulness and connection in the same way that we have. I should say, and when I say we, I mean some of us have, as a white woman who has a level of privilege. So yeah, to me, I always look at what is the cultural surrounding trauma and the familial trauma, and how does that direct whether a caregiver has the capacity or the understanding to connect with a child, and then how does that get passed on to that child? And that's kind of what we're looking at.
Yeah. So I guess the big picture of everything we've just said over the last sort of 10 minutes is this, you know, you were saying, I wonder what parenting styles, what effect that has on neurodivergence. I think that's what you was getting at.
Yeah.
And then my question is, well, I mean, our generation were maybe didn't have as much connection as we needed, but yet we're the most neurodivergent on
Yeah.
record, and not just because we're recognizing it more, but because there does seem to be genuinely more, like, per
Mhm.
capita.
Well, there are also more people, right? So that's an interesting process of how diversity works too. Is that happening? Yeah. My only fear whenever we talk about the impacts that parenting has on the brain is that the shame blame process on parents. I really don't view it as, hey, you're a parent, therefore you're totally responsible for everything you're doing, because parents are doing the best they can and with what they have, right? And so an entirely abusive parent usually had an entirely abusive parent who usually had an entirely abusive parent, right? And that line started somewhere, probably in the context of famine, genocide, enslavement, war, something terrible. So as we discuss these things, I want to be clear that the spirit of it isn't in a blame space. It's in a heartbroken space. It's heartbreaking that not every parent has the privilege to understand these concepts and give them to their children.
Yeah, 100%. And I've been talking to colleagues recently, even about like coaching and NLP and the stuff that I do, and helping other people. And one colleague said, I've got these complex cases they could really do with you. And she described them to me. And I said, those people are probably not well enough to do that. Like, for people who are very complex and probably not well enough to ever even go there, the
Yeah,
goal is stability. That's it.
absolutely. Yep.
And
Yes.
I think, I can feel all the things that I'm feeling, and process my own stuff, as most of us have to, especially in terms of our upbringing. But I can also look at my parents and other parents and other people in the eye and recognize that stability is going to be the best thing for them, that they're
Yes.
not in a place, at least right now, to
Mhm.
do any kind of like deep work. And if they ever are, it's probably not going to be anytime soon.
Right. And if they aren't, that is still part of the journey, right? So, I mean, I look at my mother's process and it's like, she started when I was 9. That's pretty incredible. That was what she could do. That was what was available to her in her context, in her world. And honestly, frankly, it's quite remarkable she did it at all. And then I'm going to do a little better, right? I still have, there are smatterings of that trauma in my parenting. I mean, there are moments it rears out and I think, oh, what in the heck did you, wow, that just came out of me. That was not in line with my value system, but man, was it in my body, right? And my hope is that my kids will have less of that and their kids will have less of that, barring any unforeseen traumas and circumstances, right?
Yeah, for sure. My therapist told me last year, we were talking about, new parents' fears of screwing up their kids. And she said, the research says you can screw up your kids about 20% of the time. And if it's no more than that, then they'll probably be like relatively okay. And
Yeah.
then, I think the other thing is like allowing space for your children to actually talk to you about stuff that's happened and how they felt, and, opportunity for repair.
Yes. Actually, the research is even better than that for parents. It's that if you're in sync, so if you are emotionally in sync, which is this qualitative experience of connection, especially in emotional moments, 30% of the time, your children will have a secure attachment.
Wow.
That's an F everywhere else, but it's a B in parenting, and that's all you need, or a C. C's get degrees, or D's get degrees, whatever. Anyway, whatever it is,
It's good enough.
yes, it's good enough. And that's a term that was coined by psychoanalyst Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, was the good enough mother or the good enough parent. And what he was noticing and seeing is this idea that if I can be in sync with you when it really matters, and I can repair and reconnect with you when we've gotten out of sync, there's a lot of human mess that won't get in your way.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love
And
that.
I thank goodness for that, because, more than 30% of the time is just too much. There's laundry, there's dinner, there's work, there are other relationships, there are pandemics, there's just too much else.
Yeah, 100%. Eli, if people want to start to get educated about this stuff, or even look at their own stuff first, like where would you recommend that they start?
There is a book called Becoming Attached. It's a really great half academic, half kind of personal reflection text. It's pretty big, but it's accessible. And it will go through kind of the history of attachment research and what we know about it, and then the clinical applications of it, and what does it mean in real life, and what does it mean now. I think that's a really great text. I mean, I'm really excited to write my text, because
I was going to say,
a lot of, and part of why we're doing this project is that a lot of the attachment focused workbooks and books are a little dry, frankly. I don't know how many you've read or what you've read, but finding ones that feel like they bring you to emotional spaces, which is what attachment is about, feels important.
Yeah.
From a clinical setting, I don't know how many therapists listen to your podcast, but I bet there are a lot. A lot of therapists are empaths. Attachment in Psychotherapy by David Wallen is a really good text. There was a pop culture book called Attached that went through some of this, but I have a beef with it because they sort of played on the idea that people who are avoidantly attached are less attached than other people, and it's not true. It's a coping skill. And I feel like the direction in the book goes sort of towards avoid avoidance if you want to have a secure relationship, and it really bothers me. But I do think it is an interesting, in terms of like, it will give you some background and some thoughts, as long as you go into the text reading it knowing, hey, they're being a little hard and they're not totally accurate on this part of it.
Yeah. I've also watched Avoidance find a secure partner that they have a great time with and then become secure. Yes. I've watched it.
My husband, 100%. Yep. It was amazing. And I was early on when I was with him and he was struggling with kind of the process of letting me in, whatever. It was around the time that the book, He's Just Not That Into You, was popular. Do you remember this book?
Yeah.
One of my friends sat me down and said, Eli, you're so remarkable. You're such a good person. You're such a good partner. He should want to be all in with you by this point. And if he's not, then he's just not that into you. And I was like, no, there's something else. I can feel it. There's something else there. And man, best decision I ever made in my life. He's the most wonderful, loving, incredible partner in the world, probably. Do they have an award for that? I should nominate him.
I love that.
Yeah, but he very much had an avoidant attachment. So
I also find like I've met a lot of avoidants who, if I'm busy losing my shit, they're the one who says nothing, and at the end they're like, do you feel better for saying it? And then you go, yeah, and then they would just move on.
Yep.
So I feel like there's
that's helpful. If you tend towards hyper arousal, to have someone who understands how to stay near the ground, it's comforting. It's like, oh, okay. You didn't think the world was ending? Well, I thought the world was ending, and now you think it might be okay. Okay.
I love that. So now that you're sort of at this point in your practice, your adult life, and your marriage, like how much difference has dealing with attachment issues made to you, considering the trajectory that you were on when you were small?
Oh, massive. I don't think there is anything that has had a bigger impact on my life, truly. I mean, I feel so deeply grounded in myself. I don't question whether I'm lovable or not. That's just not even on my docket anymore, which just makes me free. I feel very free overall. And it's not to say that life is easy, and there have been painful things. We went through multiple miscarriages, and I had to go through a bunch of surgeries and painful things, and ended up in infertility treatment, which is how I got my twin girls. I got a 2-for-1 deal. I was like, if we're doing this, we're doing 2.
Nice.
Yeah, but I think like going through weathering life's storms feels intuitive because I know how to lean and receive. What I knew how to do before was to cling and protest. And I never felt secure. And now I do, even when things are hard. And my kids feel secure, right? Like they would love to just like sit on my body all day long because they think it's their home base, because it is, and that's pretty magical.
Yeah, it is. Do you remember any particular point where you really switched into like kind of like from sort of majority anxious to sort of majority secure? Because I recognize I've met people in my life in recent times and I look at them and my first thought is, fucking hell, you're really annoying. And the second thought is, you're just like I used to be.
Totally.
And I can't quite pinpoint where that change was or how I did it.
Don't you think it's just a process? I think it's like, you know how you don't notice your own changing, but you look at a picture from a year ago and you look at a picture now and then you see the differences, but like along the way, you don't really notice it happening. I think it's more like that. I mean, I had a couple of really good therapists and then I met my husband. I remember one thing I do remember, this is a tip for anyone who's avoidant, who's dating somebody who's ambivalent. I was feeling anxious about my very introverted husband needing some time alone because my body cued that in as separation that could mean loss. And I was trying to play it cool. I always tried to play it cool. I just didn't, but I tried. And he took my hands and he looked me in the eye and he said, I want you to know I would need this exact same thing no matter who I was with. And it was like this magical opening inside my body. And I kind of see it as like he threw me a life raft and I had a choice. And in that moment, I chose to grab a hold of it. And I was like, oh, like your needs aren't about me. I mean, I would have told you that intellectually, but my body didn't know how to experience that. I was like, oh. And from that point forward, I just started to sort of radically trust him. It's like, okay, you say you're needing time alone because you're an introvert. That must be why you need your time alone, not because there's some other, person out there who would be better for you because she'd be more chill and less needy than me. Like perhaps you just need time alone. And then I think that created a real practice for me of viewing it as my responsibility to take in that reassuring data and not simply his responsibility to reassure me.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably a pinpoint moment. I'm trying to think if I can think of anything else, but
I think it's getting hang of the self-soothing as well, isn't it? It's recognizing like I'm stressed out. Why am I stressed out? Oh, this is why. And then, well, what can I do to help myself actually, and not go and constantly make this somebody else's problem.
Although I would argue that's not self-soothing, it's internalizing the soothing that people have given you previously.
Okay.
I also used friends. I had a couple of good friends who, when I was in that space, I would go to them and I would say, this is the story in my head right now. I think that Trevor is probably just getting bored of me. And they would laugh at me and they would say, we love you, but the last thing you are is boring. And then I would be like, well, maybe I'm too much. And they'd be like, hey, remember this and remember that and remember this. And I'd be like, okay, all right. Less do I feel that I soothed myself and more do I feel that I endured the space and learned to trust the reunions, right? So previously the instinct was to collapse the space. All space felt scary, so I'm going to collapse it. But it was like, I learned to tolerate the space over time to the degree that now, I mean, I love alone time so much.
You want more?
Oh, my fantasy at this moment in my life is like 3 weeks, 300 books, my computer, a beach, like some kind of like a robotic food service process, but no human contact. Like that sounds incredible. No one says my name, not once. No one calls me mom. No one needs me for anything. That would be radical. But so, and that's such a crazy fundamental shift from where I was.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you? You said you can't think of anything.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've talked about this before, sort of on other episodes and with on other interviews and stuff, but my wake up call was when I was 25 and I got the diagnosis of early cervical cancer. So here, when you're 25, you go for your first smear test.
Yep. Okay.
I'd forgotten about it. I didn't even, because at the time I'd also just been diagnosed as having pernicious anemia, so I was having B12 injections. So that was a lot of fun. So I scheduled the smear test whilst I was having all these loading injections of B12, and I'm not afraid of needles, but the actual B12 serum stings. It really stings.
Ouch.
So I'd forgotten I'd even had it. I got this letter through the post saying, "Oh, we found early cancer," and I was like, "Oh!" And literally that week, I woke up. I started taking my life seriously. I started challenging myself. I was like, "Well, I can't put up with this anymore." Like, just everything really changed, and
that's so powerful.
Yeah, I just became conscious and present. It snapped me out of whatever funk I'd been in for many years, and then 4 years from that wake up, I then got my PTSD treated, and by that point I've been living with it for 20 years, and it was really debilitating. Like, I look back and I'm like, younger me was so strong to just keep going, and with no help. And I went to get help so many times. I was like at the doctors, I was at counselors, I went to a psychiatrist once. There was no offer of trauma treatment, like, to get rid of it. And then
I love the way you just talked about your younger self.
Yeah, I've really learned to do that as well. Because another thing that I was thinking about, as you were describing, learning to trust yourself and get out of this habit of thinking, oh, I'm too much, or I'm boring, or I'm this, or I'm that, is that self-compassion. Because when I used to be like that. And anytime that I was insecure, I would know I was doing it, couldn't stop myself because it was like my life depended on it. But then afterwards I would get like total shame, like, oh, I behaved like such a freak.
Yeah, what a nut I am.
Yeah.
I'm so insecure. Yeah. Is your question, is that self-compassion? Is that your question?
Oh no, I was just saying, like, I think like oh yeah, so the question was going to be there was one in there, was, don't you think that a lot of this stuff, it's not necessarily the thing that we've done or the thing that we are processing or trying to do or trying not to do, it's often like how much shame we feel about that stuff. That's
Yeah, how normalized is it? I think that's part of where attachment theory was so pivotal for me, is that there was this body of research saying 50% of the world has the same experience and these same patterns, and it's not like there's something wrong with you. There was something wrong in your environment and it triggered this response, and there's a human element to it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I like to tell my clients and people that getting old has such a bad rap, because truly it's such a gift. I mean, for me, every decade has gotten better.
Yeah,
every decade, more self-knowledge, more groundedness, more connection, more clarity on what is mine and what matters to me. I really, especially for the female identified population, I wish for more women who were elders as opposed to older women trying to reclaim their youth. I want more examples of people who are in their elderness and celebrating it and enjoying it and giving us a path to look forward to, as opposed to the idea that all the good stuff dies when we're young. It's just not true. I don't feel that.
It's not true. Well, I think they were saying as well, like, I saw I think it was on We Can Do Hard Things podcast with Glennon Doyle.
I listened to it. So lovely.
There's an episode a few weeks ago. It's so good. There's an episode a few weeks ago with, oh, my memory for details again, but they were talking about aging in general. And they were saying that often, particularly for women, in their sort of like later midlife, if not, like their old age, are statistically happier. Like, you get once you get past sort of middle age and you get older, you tend to get happier and happier. And it's not statistically, it's not influenced by your health or many other things. It's to do with being older, and I think they just recommend having plenty of social connections of different ages, so they're not all dying at once.
Right.
And I agree with you. I think getting older is brilliant.
Yeah, and maybe that's us traumatized kids, right? So getting older has been this paradox of having permission not to be in charge of everybody else. So the older we get, the more freer we get, the more, there's less of a burden. I'm not sure.
It's so interesting. I literally said to my colleague yesterday, because we were talking about having kids or not having kids, and I said, I really, really like kids, but I like me more. And I said, I only started my sort of trauma recovery 5 years ago. So up until recently, I've not really had a life before.
Right. You're trying to figure out you. Absolutely.
Well, I just want all of this space. Like, it's so new to me, and I want it for me.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Eli. It's been absolutely amazing. Where can people find you if they want more content?
I am on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, all under the same handle, Attachment Nerd. So those are the best places to find me. I am working on putting up a website and having some more in-depth content, but who knows how long that will take. So you can check on that at attachmentnerd.com. And I will, on all of those platforms, be letting everybody know. The book will be coming out December 2023. So it's a while from now, but
yeah,
launch.
It'll be much needed.
I'm excited. It's just such a great way to learn about yourself and find security.
Definitely. Are you already published, or is this going to be your first book? This is
going to be my first book. Yeah. I'm so excited.
Nothing like it. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. It's so good to be here with you. I just enjoy your presence so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it and think someone you know might benefit from it, please do share it with them and leave me a review. If you'd like more resources and information, you can go to my website, mooksharrishill.com, where you can also join my mailing list or Facebook group to stay up to date and in contact. You can also connect with me on social media at Empaths Revolution. The Empaths Revolution podcast was created and produced by your host, Harris Eddie Hill.